So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Zygmunt Fisher. I am a senior at Chestnut Hill College, and I'm a dual major in secondary education and history with a minor in special education. So I just want to, once again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to interview. And, it's unfortunate that this has to be on this sort of format. It's a little awkward doing a lesson without students, but, we'll make do, obviously. But once again, I want to thank you again, and I'm really excited for this opportunity. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So for this first part of my lesson, normally what I like to do is I like to start the kids off with a warm-up question. So normally I would write it up on the board. Which side do you think started the Civil War and why? And normally I give the students a unit packet that has all their handouts and their readings and things like that already in the packet that they have before we even started. But just for example, today I'll just have them write it down on a piece of paper. And so I really like warm-up questions, obviously, most teachers do, because it really gets the kids kind of in that mode to focus, and it gives them an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. So normally when I ask these kinds of warm-up questions, I like to spur a discussion. So I don't like to take too much time on the warm-up question, but if it really spurs a intelligent discussion, the kids are enjoying what we're talking about, then I'll let it go as long as possible. I really like welcoming discussion and welcoming conversation in my class that's obviously academic. I think it's a really great way for students to learn almost in that Socratic method to an extent, but I think students really learn a lot when they talk amongst each other and they debate and share their ideas. So I think it's really important, like I said, to just kind of initiate these kind of conversations. So I would start off with this warm-up, and then, like I said, I'd write it on the board, and then I would go over it, and then I might ask, let's say, for example, I'll say, so Talani, I'll use this student. So Talani, why do you think the Civil War, which side do you think started the Civil War and why? And then Talani might say something, and then someone else might raise their hand and say something else, and start that discussion. And this is a good question to kind of to know what they know already and what they don't know. So this lesson in general is just we already started, just to give you an idea of what we're doing. So we already did territories and prelude to Civil War, just kind of talking about the things that led to the Civil War. So the argument over slavery, the argument over territories, voting rights, things like that. And this would be the very start of the Civil War. So we're going to be talking about Fort Sumter today. And so that would be one of the intro lessons. So it might be lesson 2, 3, maybe 1. But it's going to be early on in this unit. So, like I said, this is going to be a good background for the students and just kind of talk about how the actual conflict started between the North and the South, the Union and the Confederates. So I'm just going to jump right into it with my reading. And I'm going to cut this first video. Okay, so, all right, class. So we're going to start with our reading. So it should be entitled Fort Sumter Reading, and it's in your packet and the handout I just gave you as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start off reading the intro, and I'll read the first paragraph for you. And so after each paragraph, we're going to be going back to our gist sheets. I know we've done this before. I know you guys done this in English a lot, but I thought it would be helpful for our social studies lesson today. So after I read the intro, and then after we read each paragraph, there's a number. So it says paragraph 1, and then I have a count 1, and then paragraph 2, and then a count 2, all the way down to, like I said, paragraph 8. So we're going to be doing a mix of popcorn reading. I'll call on some students, and after each section, I'm going to call on someone else in the class, and we're going to try to come up with a gist statement for each section. So let me start with the intro. On the afternoon of April 11th, waving a white flag, 2 members of General Beauregard's staff rode across Charleston's harbor to Fort Sumter carrying a written demand for surrender. One of the emissaries, Stephen D. Lee, wrote the experience after the war. All right, so based off of what we read in this intro, what kind of writing do you think this is? Do you think it's a secondary source? Is it a primary source? What do you guys think? Let's think about. So it says, one of the emissaries, Stephen D. Lee, wrote of the experience after the war. So what does that tell you about Stephen D. Lee and where he was in regards to him seeing this action? And then hopefully someone would say, it's a primary source. Yes, you were correct. It's a primary source. So it's a primary source because Stephen D. Lee was actually there, right, guys? And then everyone would say yes. So we're going to start with paragraph 1. This demand was delivered to Major Anderson at 3:45 p.m. by 2 aides of General Beauregard, James Chestnut Jr., and myself. So, guys, I want you guys to highlight this line. James Chestnut Jr. and myself. At 4:30 p.m., he handed us his reply, refusing to accede to the demand. Make sure we're underlining this, guys. But added, gentlemen, if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days. The reply of Major Anderson was put in General Beauregard's hands at 5:15 p.m., and he was also told of this informal remark. Anderson's reply and remark was communicated to Confederate authorities at Montgomery. The Secretary of War, L.P. Walker, replied to Beauregard as follows. So, okay, let's go back to the sentence we highlighted. It should be the second sentence. And myself, at 4:30 p.m., he handed us his reply, refusing to accede to the demands. So, what word in that line makes you see that Stephen D. Lee was there. Right, where it says Beauregard, James Chestnut Jr., and myself. Exactly. And then he says, at 4:30 p.m., he handed us his reply, refusing to accede to the demand, but added, gentlemen, if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved in a few days. So I know accede is a little bit of a big vocabulary word for us, but I think it's important for us to underline it and talk about what it means because we need to figure out, through context clues, what this means. So based off of what he's saying, handed us reply, refusing to accede to the demand, but he's saying, gentlemen, if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we'll be starved out in a few days. So what's he kind of trying to say when he says refusing to accede to the demand? But if you don't shoot, then we will be starved out. What do you guys think? And then hopefully, get some hands up. Yeah, exactly. So it says refusing to accede to the demand. He's basically saying we're not going to listen. We're going to keep staying in this fort. We're not going to leave and we're not going to surrender. But if you don't shoot us, we will be starved out. We'll be forced to surrender, basically, and leave. So, based on the tone of this, how do you think that the Union side who's at Fort Sumter, how do you think they feel about this fighting? Do you think they want to start the Civil War? I mean, from what I'm seeing, when he's saying, gentlemen, if you not batter this fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days, he's basically saying, look, we don't want to start this war, right? We don't want to get this started. But the Confederate general and his troops are sending over their demand saying that you have to surrender. So what do you guys think a good gist statement for this first account would be? Yeah, I mean, okay, so hopefully this is what we would normally get someone raising their hands. So I think for this first account, I think it's important for us to mark that basically the Union commander refuses to demand a surrender. The Confederates come over and give their treaties for surrender, and the Union commander basically refuses. So that's what we're going to write for account 2. And then here I would go on to the next one, and I might call in another student. So I'll just go through, the first couple of these and give you guys an example, because this would take way more than 20 minutes if I did the whole section. Do not desire needlessly to bombard Fort Sumter. If Major Anderson will state the time at which, as indicated by him, he will evacuate and agree that in the meantime he will not use his guns against us unless ours should be employed against Fort Sumter, you are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. If this or its equivalent be refused, reduce the fort as your judgment decides to be most practicable. So, when they say do not desire needlessly to bombard Fort Sumter, Major Anderson will state the time at which, as indicated by him, he will evacuate and agree that in the meantime he will not use his guns against us. So let's remember that Major Anderson is the Union leader in Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a Union fort, and it was off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, which was a Confederate city. So, here I'm going to have to cut this off. So Major Anderson was a leader at the Confederate fort, right? So if he's saying do not needlessly desire to bombard Fort Sumter, Major Anderson will state at each time, as indicated by him, he will evacuate. So what is this saying? Do not needlessly bombard. So if he's saying needlessly, what does that kind of tell you guys how the Confederates are feeling? If they're saying needlessly, what does that mean to you? And then calling someone. Yeah, so when you're saying do not needlessly bombard, they're basically saying don't just bombard the fort for no reason, kind of showing that they don't necessarily want to start this fight either. And so, move down to the next sentence. Fort Sumter, you are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. So what are you saying? Unless ours should be employed against Fort Sumter, you are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. What do you think the effusion of blood means? Yeah, so basically they're trying to say that they're trying to avoid effusion means they're trying to avoid spilling of blood. They don't want people to die based off of this little Fort Sumter and this Confederate action. They don't want to have to shoot down this fort, and the Union doesn't want to have to be bombarded. They don't have to shoot back as well. So I think, what do you think would be a good gist statement for this? How do you think we can summarize this account number 2? Yeah, so I think, like we said, how the Union refuses to surrender, but they don't want to fight. The same thing for the Confederate commander. The Confederate commander is telling the men to not to fire on the fort for no reason. So he's basically saying that we want to avoid this fight as well. Right, so I think that's a good gist statement. All right, now let's go on to our next one. We have our first question. So what are the Confederates asking the fort to do? So if we turn to our back page, we have our first question. what are the Confederates asking the Union soldiers to do? So what's the Confederate? What are they asking? What did Stephen D. Lee with General Beauregard ask for the Union to do? Yeah, so basically he just asked them to surrender, right? He asked them to surrender and give up the fort, and there was no need for any bloodshed. Exactly. So let's move on to the third paragraph. The same aides bore second communication to Major Anderson based on the above instruction, which was placed in his hands at 12:45 a.m. April 12th. His reply indicated that he would evacuate the fort on the 15th, provided he did not in the meantime receive contradictory instructions from his government or additional supplies, but he declined to agree not to open his guns upon the Confederate troops. In the event of any hostile demonstration on their part against his flag, Major Anderson made every possible effort to retain the aides till daylight, making one excuse and then another for not replying. Finally, at 3:15 a.m., he delivered his reply in accordance with their instructions. The aides read it and finding it unsatisfactory, gave Major Anderson this notification. Okay, so the aides bore second communication to Major Anderson. So when they say the aides bore second communication to Major Anderson based on the above instructions, so what were the above instructions? What did the Confederate general ask him to do? Yeah, so he asked them to surrender, right? He asked them to surrender, and then that way they could avoid bloodshed. Exactly. And so he's sending these people over a second time on a boat. And so when it says, Major Anderson made every possible effort to retain the aides till daylight, making one excuse and then another for not replying. So what does Major Anderson know at this point? What did we already say? What did he already say in the first paragraph? Right? He said that he's not going to surrender. He refuses to surrender. He doesn't want to be the first person to surrender. And he knows it's going to look bad. And like I said, he's refusing to surrender. But why do you think he kept the aides till daylight, even though he knew what was going to happen, even though he knew he wasn't going to surrender? Why do you think he wanted to keep the aides till daylight? Yeah, exactly. So he wanted to keep the aides till daylight because he knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to say no. He knew he wasn't going to surrender, but he knew what that meant. So he was stuck between a really tough decision between surrendering and looking bad and putting a stain on the Union name, or not surrendering and potentially getting fired upon and losing the fort in total. So he held every single person who came over from the Confederate side until the very last minute at 3:15 a.m. So what do you think a good gist statement? How do you think we can summarize this paragraph? Okay, so we're going to write, Major Anderson did the best to hold the Confederate emissaries up from going back to the Confederate fort. And so why did I say he did that again? Can someone remind me, why did I say Major Anderson did his best to hold the Confederate emissaries? Yeah, so he wanted to avoid starting this war as well, right? He didn't want to get involved in this. He thought that, he knew that if he sent them back with the reply no, that this was going to start the war. And he wanted to avoid this as much as possible. Great. So let's turn to we're going to go to paragraph 4. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, 12th, 1861, 3:20 a.m. So why is this date written like this? Why do you see it says Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April 12th, 1861, 3:20 a.m.? What does that kind of read like? Yeah, it almost reads like a diary, right? So it's almost it's giving you very specific dates and very specific times. So that kind of leads you to believe that this person was here, right? If they're using these very specific details. Right, so if you're telling a story that you saw in person, you're going to be very specific. You can talk about the weather, the time of day, who was around, what clothes the person was wearing. If you're just hearing it from secondary, like a secondary source, you're not going to have all that specific information, right? So let's read this fourth paragraph. Actually, I'm going to stop this and then I'll read the fourth paragraph.